barriers to trade and enhancing business competitiveness. We work in Rwanda, Kenya, Rwanda, DRC, Burundi, and lately we're expanding into West Africa, where I would like to support the free trade area that's just commencing. I don't know if you recognize, this is one of the border posts that we have supported in Uganda. This is Malaba border post, working very closely with URA. And in Uganda, we've had a number of interventions to support infrastructure to really reduce the barriers to trade. We've supported the OSPP in Busia, in Mutukula. We are currently working to build infrastructure at Goli and Toroko. Then we are building the Gulu Logistics Hub, working with the European Commission and the FCDO, the British government. So I'm basically going to present findings of a study that we undertook between October and November, just really showing what it is, what are the trade costs that freighters are encountering on the corridor. Next, so this picture just kind of shows a portfolio of where we're working, showing both the northern and the southern corridor, where we really focus on reducing the barriers to trade on that corridor. Next slide, please. The survey instruments that we used were key three ones, where we did a traffic census, we did an origin and destination survey, and we did a freight and transport cost survey, where we targeted about 80 farms around the region. In the interest of time, I won't go through the survey methodologies. I'll just move to slide 7, please. Please move to slide 7, yes, that one. What I would like to highlight is that we really took a different approach to the way we approach the overall trade costs. The way we really document costs, most of the studies that you see really focus on the direct trade costs. How much is it taking a freighter to move from Mombasa, perhaps to Kigali? But this study kind of took a wider approach, where we want to document the entire costs, right from the port to when the goods are delivered to the final consumer. So we broke down the costs into aspects of the port costs, what are the direct transport costs, what is the cost of trade time, what are the direct compliance costs, and I think these include the various tariffs that the various agencies have. Then the indirect cost of delay. If I do not have the goods that I need to supply to my consumers because of the various, maybe because of delays in getting them out of the ports, what does this mean to the cost of me having my inventory in place? And then, of course, looking at the illicit trade costs, what are the bribes that the truckers have to incur at the various web bridges across the region? So the key findings, before I delve into the Uganda findings, next slide, please. We found that on the northern corridor, the total cost to trade is close to $3. That is between Mombasa and Kampala. Again, close to $3 between Dar es Salaam and Bujumbura. And then we found that the total cost between Dar es Salaam and Kigali comes to nearly $3.50. This is the average cost per US dollar per kilometer. Next slide, please. So this is a slide that shows the frequently traveled routes to Kampala to trade. The key routes, it's actually, we have the routes are about 20, but this is just a summary of the most traveled routes. So we found that the Mombasa-Kampala route is the frequently traveled route for goods coming into Kampala. And the cost is really lower on this route, and it can come down further if we had an increase in the two-way traffic. So you find that we find more goods coming into the country as imports, with very few going out, which means truckers leave the country empty. So this would really come down if we can really increase the level of our exports. I think what I wanted to point out here, if you look at the Mombasa-Nairobi route, with the rail cargo, there's a new rail system that transports goods from Mombasa into Naivasha, then I think they are loaded into Kampala. We find that the railway is now carrying most of the containerized cargo, so the trucks on this route are really carrying only specialized cargo. So you find that the costs on this route are very short route, but the costs are really going up here because the availability of trucking companies is lower, so the costs are really become higher, so because most of the traffic is now coming through rail. Next slide, please. This is mainly an analysis of what are the most frequently transported goods to Kampala. We note vegetable products, textiles, mineral products, and chemical products. We kind of lumped all the other commodities, which the 25% has. We couldn't break down each and everything, but we have like, if anyone would be interested in the actual breakdown that we found out, we can share the detailed report that we have. So we thought this would be interesting information for you to look at. The kind of trucks that are using the route, I think I can skip that. I would like to now really talk about Uganda-specific results. If you move to slide 14. So of course, like I highlighted, slide 14, please. So Mombasa, Kampala, over 20%. Most of the traffic really originates from Mombasa, terminating in Kampala. A lot of traffic terminating to Juba, Kampala, between Kampala and Juba. Of course, I think we're trading very closely with South Sudan. And then traffic terminating, passing through Kampala, but then going to Juba. Those are the one of the top 5 routes. And then the national ones in nature, there's a lot of traffic that's directed towards Arua, about 8.7%, Arua and Gulu. We found that this is quite a very upcoming trading hub, as a center that can actually, we can aggregate our produce there before it goes on to South Sudan. And I will just talk about one of the interventions that we think for future programming for Uganda to reduce trade costs, what we can do there. Next slide, please. So just to highlight what the total transport cost, because this is what is interesting to most people, as this is what has been calculated. So for the liquid tank trailers, the total cost per trip averaging to about $2,300 for the tanker trailers. For the containers, close again, $2,237. So on average, it's taking a trucker close to $2,200 just for a single trip between Mombasa and Kampala. And this is something that we would like to come down. Next slide, please. Oh, yes. So I talked about the frequently used routes, maybe just to highlight that the most common commodities traded between Mombasa and Kampala are metals. And then between Kampala and Juba, foodstuffs. And then between Kampala, Arua, Kampala, Gulu, foodstuffs. And then the mineral products again, between Kampala and Gulu. So just talking about the key barriers to trade, road conditions, almost 26% of the drivers that were interviewed they thought the road conditions could be improved. The second frequently identified issue was the various stops at the railway bridges, though this concerned just about 6%, about close to 7% of the drivers. At the regional level, because we did this for a number of countries, the issue most identified as moderate or severe was again the road conditions. So talking about us expanding trade in the region, I think this is something that we need to work on as a region. But by contrast, vehicle conditions, the port and border posts were really not identified as those, not a challenge or as a slight challenge, which points to the aspect that the countries and the regions have really tried to facilitate trade by really improving these barriers, which used to be quite an issue some time back. So, Mr. Chair, just winding up, future priorities. So we think corridor volumes are increasing, and we see trade, we see the Mombasa port volumes have grown significantly over the years, projected to grow to over 52 million tons in a low scenario. But we need investment to continue to meet the growing demand. As the volumes increase, any progress will further reduce any gains on cost and time that we've made over the years on the corridor. Otherwise, we'll have congestions at the various crossing points for trade. So we think the future priorities for investment to support corridor trade and to further bring the costs down. Next slide, please. How can we increase the capacity of the corridor to handle this additional traffic so that it moves forward in a seamless way? Can we tap or rail investment? Can we move towards using our waterways more, of course, supporting the roads infrastructure more. And then how do we make strategic and catalytic investments that move traffic away from the key centers? Talking about how Kampala and Gulu, there's a lot of traffic between Kampala and Gulu. If we make investments that increase efficiency, why should a trucker come and stop in Kampala? Yet they could come right from Mombasa, pass through Tororo, and connect to Gulu. This will reduce congestion in Kampala. We can develop facilities that will facilitate consumption areas along the way. So let's think of such strategic investments. And then how do we build upon existing reforms? For instance, the Kenya government has kind of, its focus has improved the link between Mombasa and Naivasha. So what can Uganda do to tap on this for transportation of cargo? How do we now link, improve our linkages between Naivasha and Kampala? And then I think looking at the people perspective, how do people living along these corridors gain from investments being made? Are agriculture products are they moving any quicker? Can empty trucks need to be used more efficiently? Is this happening due to existing laws? Do we have consolidation centers for people to utilize trucks that are using the corridor? So these are things that we need to think about. Please, next slide, please. I think with the ESC, DRC is essential to the ESC. How do we integrate this into the Mombasa Port Trade Network? How do we support formalization? Much of the trade between DRC and the rest of the world cannot be traced because of this informality. This is lost revenue for the countries that really engage in this trade. How can we support that better? So lastly, my last slide, we note that the COVID pandemic resulted in very significant deterioration in government finances, with many developing countries facing challenges in the economic environment. And then donor finance has also become very limited. So we need to create new models that will leverage finance from both the private sector and funding instruments to meet these corridor needs, because what we've talked about all require investments. So how do we ensure that? So yeah, new approaches for corridor funding are really required. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Can we put our hands together to appreciate the panelists? I'm trying to redeem time, and at 10:30 I will be signing off. So MC, don't get worried about this. You have heard from the three. The first one was export, leveraging exports for growth, Uganda's participation in international and regional trade. And also, Professor touched on the African market. And when we talk about the African continental free trade area, we are talking about a market of 1.2 billion now, and in 2050 will be 2.5 billion, with an opportunity, which I call an opportunity, of an import bill of 547 billion annually. Africa imports 547 billion of goods annually. And this strategy, Professor, that we are saying, import substitution and export promotion, that we should repress all this. So this is a huge market with the GDP using the PPP method of 6.7 trillion. This is the market that we are talking about. We are not talking about Kanyanya or other markets. We are talking about these huge markets that we should be taking advantage of. But Prof, before the lead discussant comes in, I thought we can talk about promotion of exports, especially Africa and Uganda, without talking about this mineral resource that we have, the minerals. Because remember a few years ago, gold alone was our lead export, around 1.5 billion. How can we have a discussion of export promotion without talking about the minerals themselves? Because they can be a source of a great opportunity for Africa and Uganda to export. So I know that we have been sitting for almost 45 minutes. So I want you to stand up and look at your neighbor. How can we miss talking about minerals at this export economic growth debate? Just ask that question. Ask that question. How can we? We cannot, because, Prof, gold alone, the gold deposits we have is 12.8 trillion US dollars annually. 12.8 trillion. Can you get seated again? Uganda alone, Prof, we are now having a deposit of 12.8 trillion US dollars, gold alone. Tangling, 3 trillion. Talk about iron ore deposits, 300, and look at the imports of steel that we are having, over 300 million US dollars annually. So how can we be at this great economic forum and don't talk about this resource? So this is what we are going to be discussing in the next 15 minutes. And I want to request our lead discussant in 5 minutes to reflect on this, and then we'll open discussion. As I promised you, at 10:30, I'll be signing off because we are redeeming time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Minister. It's going to be difficult not to obey the time limit set by Honorable Minister. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, my name is Kenneth Barije, and I'm the Managing Director of Mountain Harvest. It's a specialty coffee exporting company. We started in 2017, so we've just survived the 3 years that Professor and Alex talked about when exporting companies die. I would like to focus my discussion on the necessary strategic investment that we need to make as a country, and pay attention also to the reasons from the exporter's point of view why companies in Uganda do not survive in the first year. We had about a survival rate of about 6%, which is alarming. But before I do that, allow me to highlight the importance of coffee to our economy, so that as we discuss, you move a little bit from minerals back to coffee. And I want to highlight just 4 things. Number one, coffee employs about 1.7 million Ugandans. These are smallholder farmers. Now, 25% of the estimated farming households this marks 25% of the estimated farming households, according to UBOS. When you take an average of 4.5 people per household, you're talking about 7.6 million people in coffee. That is about 17% of Uganda's population. Now, the second one, whereas it is commonly said that Ugandan farmers are cheated by exporters, the data that we have show a different picture. Now, for example, if you take the price average of 2,500 shillings per kg of Robusta Chiboko, or 6,800 per kg of Robusta FOQ, or 11,000 shillings per kg of parchment for Arabica. And I've taken the lowest prices that UCDA provided yesterday on their website. They give a range, I've taken the lowest. You're talking about a Ugandan farmer getting 80% of the FOB price. Then coffee, in the whole year, bringing in about 670 million US dollars into the economy, and the farmer getting 80%, you're talking about 670 out of 837. That's the 80% going to the farmer. The third, whereas most countries in the world were slowing growth during COVID, Uganda was one of the economies that we saw recovering fast. And the reasons include coffee. To highlight that the coffee exports during the period between 2019 and 2022, we saw an increase from about 4.1 million bags in 2019 to over 6 million bags in 2022. So whereas everything was going down, export of coffee was increasing. And the fourth, It's about the opportunities that we see available on the continent. According to the US Department of Agriculture, Egypt, which is part of the regional agreements that we are discussing, imported last year about 2 million bags of coffee. Add about 750 for Algeria, 720,000 bags for South Africa, and 690,000 bags for Morocco. You're talking about 4 countries importing into Africa. These are non-producing countries. Importing into Africa about 72% of Uganda's total production of coffee. Now, let me go to highlight a few things that I think the government and development partners should be looking at for them to facilitate exporters to survive beyond 1 year and also take advantage of all these opportunities that my colleagues talked about. Number one is to ensure that we actually get the coffee. We get coffee of quality, good quality that can compete in the region. Farm productivity is steadily going down, mainly because of the age of the coffee tree. On the average coffee tree is aged 20 years, and farmers hesitate to stamp coffee because in most cases it is the only source of income, and they fear looking at 3 years of no income. So the causes for that, it's about climate change, and we would like the government to support more with fertilizers and irrigation. At the same point, as we get worried, Honorable Minister, Secretary of the Treasurer, as you move to the parish development model, after seeing how the model that you've been using over the past 5 years has increased coffee volumes, we are worried that we might not sustain the volumes to get the 20 million bags. The second that I would like to highlight is on the raw survival rates for export companies. It's about the cost of financing. The financing that we have in the country, one for the exporters, you're talking about digits above 12% if I talk about Uganda Development Bank, and you go into 20% for commercial banks. Now, there is also the side of the farmers who do not access finance, and that cost goes to the exporter who has to finance the needs of the farmer off-season. And that increases the cost of business, which will make us less competitive in the market. The third that I would like to highlight, it is about the quality of the coffee that we produce. The countries that we neighbor, Kenya, Ethiopia, Rwanda, which countries would be now competing with us in these regional agreements that we are talking about, are producing higher quality coffee. And the solution that we would like the government to support us in is to improve our processing. We are happy that UCDA recently started giving wet mills to farmers and training them. But again, when we hear discussions of merging UCDA with the ministry at a time when you should be supporting us more, then we get concerned. And lastly, Honorable Chair, which is my final message to the government, it's about the efficiencies. And this talks to Catherine's discussion about the hub. Now, when I have to export a container from Mbale or Kasese or from Zombo, I have to call in UCDA to come and take samples, analyze, and give me an approval. At the best, I'm talking about a few days. If we had these hubs in the main coffee-producing regions, Masaka, Mbale, Kasese, Zombo, where now I can get an approval in a day, it would make my business efficient, and then I would take advantage of all these opportunities that you're talking about. Once again, thank you very much for paying attention.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we want to open this discussion to the audience. But ladies and gentlemen, I'm finding it a bit difficult. We are working under very strict protocol issues. And while we are here, the Secretary to Treasury came in. So I'm finding it hard how I can recognize him. Maybe can I say he walked in. Ladies and gentlemen, the PSST walked in while we were here. So the MC will recognize him properly later on and appreciate him. Thank you. So friends, as we open this discussion, please do remember the context of this forum, building a self-sustaining economy to weather the future shocks. So as you make a contribution on the policy recommendation that they have given us, how do you contribute towards this? How do we build a self-sustaining economy to withstand the shocks of the future? In the interest of time, we shall have, each row I think we are going to have one person. We start with this side, anybody this side? Okay, we'll pick two here, and just make it brief, 1 minute, 1 minute.
30 seconds. They told me they can make it shorter.
Okay, MC, you are giving the one I have not given.
Oh, which one?
I gave the other one.
Okay, start there.
I'm very disciplined. Sorry. Start the other side. This the coffee, ED of coffee? Yeah. Yes. Then two here, and then we come to you.
Honorable Chair, I will go straight to the point, and this is about quality assurance of coffee. I'm happy to know that the discussant has talked about the great gains we've made, and I want to assure the audience that UCDA is working on expansion, decentralization of quality assurance hubs. We have just acquired land from Kasese, we have acquired land from Bari, and we are expanding our laboratory in Kampala. We recently constructed an office in Jinja, and therefore all these is an inspection of the increased volumes and to look at how we can increase our coffee quality. But I hasten to add, coffee, Uganda is #3 in the world in coffee quality, second to Kenya, to Ethiopia, but we also look at where we have come from. And we have an ambition of overtaking them, because in terms of production, we are actually ahead of them.
Thank you. What's the time frame? When do you want to overtake them?
By 2025.
Okay. The next one behind. Direct a question or make a comment and make it brief.
Thank you, Honorable Chair. My name is Donald Olama. I come from the coffee area of Zombo. Now, I'm directing my questions to all the four panels who are there. Because as you mentioned, we are tackling economic growth, how we can increase economic growth in Uganda. But I have seen that the presentation which has been made has mainly tackled the symptoms of the problems we are having in the economy, because they're giving us statistics. I thought what they would be doing is to give us solutions to the problems that we are having. For instance, if I go to the presentation of the first presenter was Professor Alexander. No? Uganda has not taken full advantage of the regional East African community markets. Now, how do we get Ugandans or the business firms which are here to take advantage of these markets which are there, the regional markets, the continental market, and even the overseas markets? Because we need to know what are those things that we need to do in able to be competitive in those markets. Now, the other area we need to tackle is value addition. One area why we are not very competitive is because the products, as has been identified by the discussants here, our products are of very poor quality, and even the value that we are not adding much value to the products. That's why they cannot compete on the market. You find South Africa and Egypt leading on the continental market because of the high quality of value addition of the products that they have. That's why if you go to our supermarkets, you find those products from South Africa and Egypt are the one dominating. So we need to get products of Uganda dominating these markets. When we improve, we increase on the value addition of these markets.
Thank you.
Wait a minute, Mr. Chairman. I'm directing this one to Ms. Catherine. How do we get, 1 minute. Yeah, this was this is Professor Lawrence. Now, how do we get small exporters to grow? Because this is where the problem is. We are saying that, you said that we have small exporters, but we need to get them to grow. So how do we help those small exporters to grow? That's what we need to tackle. And then, lastly, to Mr. Barige, about the coffee exports. Also, you have been mentioning that we are having poor quality coffee here. So how do we get the quality of our coffee improving? Because what I know is that Zombo is producing one of the best quality, I think, in the whole world. So why is it that our products are not able to get markets outside? So those are issues that we need to address.
Thank you very much. From Zombo, we will, this side we pick her, Honorable, then him, and then we'll go this side as we conclude. Yeah, Honorable Secretary, please. Okay. 1 second.
Yeah, just one question. Catherine, is it possible for you to include private sector in your presentation? Specifically, what I want to know is, was private sector part of the plan? And if so, what is in it for us? Secondly, the reason I want this clear is that right now we are rehabilitating Entebbe Airport. But with the private sector have come to know that there is no planned scanner for vehicles. So when we are exporting our vegetables, tomatoes, nebigenderako, you get to the airport and you have to offload the lorry at the scanning place. They scan, you reload the lorry in order to go where you load the plane. Really, can we always be part and parcel of the plan, the implementation, and of course the enjoyment? Thank you.
Okay, what I was saying, what does it mean?
Nebigenderako is normally English from Busoga, which means and the rest.
Okay, the gentleman in yellow. I can't resist that color. 1 minute, and then we move this side.
God willing, I want to be your chairman, national chairman, following Yoweri Kaguta Museveni when he's done. Pray for me. My name is Kawoya Chigongo. I come from Chiebando, so Kawempe North. My concern goes to Alexander and then Lawrence. First, I think to Alexander. Considering your policy recommendations, there are 4. It's not that Ugandans don't know that. They do. Now, what I'm asking you, Professor Alexander, what is the best way how, okay? With tariffs, yes, we've done that. In regional integration, we are there. We like make it, it's like a song in East Africa and in Uganda. But what is the best way how? Do you see any other ways which you can recommend other than giving like a professor, a lecture, such that we can implement it and then grow forward?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Another question to Lawrence. Uganda on her own has done what you see, what is available, what you've just mentioned. Do you have ways from Europe outside approach perspective, what we can do, or other ways we can do in order to diversify the crops or commodities for export? I beg to move for God and my country.
Thank you. We have him, the first one.
Thank you. Mine is just a comment, especially on the availability of credit.
Yes.
Many Ugandans are SMEs, of course, and smallholder farmers, and they have no access to this credit. And it's important that they should be included in the system. And secondly, investment in sustainable value addition and innovation. That's what will help many SMEs and smaller farmers to get included in the exports for growth and leveraging the exports for growth, because that will offer introduction of new production techniques, new products, or new means of organizing these products.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So your neighbor, and then finally at the gentleman behind.
Thank you.
1 minute, please.
This is Daniel from Secretariat. My question is to Professor Alexander about the AfCFTA. In March 2018, African countries signed the agreement of the African Continental Trade Area Agreement, which is legal instrument establishing a free trade area among the African Union states. And to my understanding, I've learned that this is to provide an opportunity for countries in the region to competitively integrate into the global economy. This is to reduce poverty and promote inclusion. Now, basically, for the SMEs, these are the small, medium enterprises confronted with challenges that affect their production and export potentially, hindering their ability to participate fully in the global trade. I would only want to ask a brief question, but before that, a keynote. This is the low level of awareness among the FST. So my question is, how best can the Federation of Small, Medium Enterprises create awareness on the African continental free trade area to strengthen the export capacities of small and medium enterprises, basically for the youth and for the women, because I wouldn't talk about other stakeholders.
Thank you very much. The gentleman, no, Molondo, the first one there. Yeah, that one, then finally you.
Thank you very much. Good morning. My name is Martin Fowler. I work in the Economic Growth Office of USAID in Kampala. Just a couple of comments. Alex, I'm very disappointed by your recommendations. I came to the first high-level economic growth forum a few years ago, and I think those recommendations, which have been mentioned by the man dressed in yellow as well, productivity increase, reduce the time and cost of exporting, and strengthen adherence to international standards. Those were given, I think, 6 years ago at the first conference. We haven't moved on, so it's not really a complaint about you. It's just we don't seem to have moved on from those initial recommendations, which is unfortunate. Catherine, just 2 points. One is, you've mentioned the costs of transporting a container, 2,400 per ton. It would have been interesting for you to have shown how those costs have changed over time, and therefore give justification for some of the huge expenditure that's gone into TMEA and other efforts to improve transportation. What were the costs in 2012? You have 2012 figures. It would be really useful to know how we've improved from where we were. And also, given what Professor Edwards was talking about, it would also be useful to know what are the costs of getting a container to other African markets, which is what we're now looking at much more. We need to look out of the region, look elsewhere. So what's the cost of getting a container to Kinshasa, for example? Thank you.
Thank you. Finally, Mlondo.
Thank you very much. My name is Moses Mlondo. I'm a journalist working with New Vision. My question goes to our policymakers, especially the Minister Bahati and maybe the Secretary to the Treasury. Well, Honorable Minister, you just talked about the issue of gold that a few months back it had become our leading export, earning us much more than even what we are getting from coffee. We would like to know what happened. Because some of us heard that it is because of the new taxes that you had imposed on the various stages of the value chain of gold, and perhaps that is why all of a sudden, because even when these days I read the performance of the economy report, gold is no longer even appearing on the list of our exports. So we would like to know what happened, if it is an issue of the new tax that was imposed, what are the plans of government maybe to scrap this tax, and because so many people had invested in gold. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we'll now turn to the panelists, but Alex, don't feel so. I stand with you, because the question the gentleman asked, I think should be asking the Ministry of Finance. He's saying 6 years ago, 2016, we made these recommendations. They are the same that Alex is still raising. How far have you gone? I'm sure either at the beginning of the forum they will, or at the end, they will probably tell us the progress on the recommendations that we have made. But I will ask you, Alex, and then maybe anybody from finance about the taxes on gold before we go for the PSST, or Moses, can you make a comment? Then we'll have Alex in that order. Professor,
you tell
Catherine, and
what we are doing for his goal.
The tax in 1 second.
Hear me?
Okay. And remember, he works with the media.
Yes. Yeah, there was a tax that had been imposed on processed gold that was very prohibitive. And so importers, or exporters rather, stopped exporting. But what we did, because the tax was increased when we were in Parliament, so what we did was to take it up in the new Minerals and Mining Act, which was which was passed by Parliament in this year, but it had not been assented to because the President had some issues with it. Now it's gone back to him for assent after addressing the concerns he had. Once this is done, then...
but what did you do? You said what we did, we take it to the... What did you do exactly?
Oh, you want all the details?
Did you reduce or you increase it?
No, there was no tax initially. There was a levy that had been proposed, a small levy of $200 per ton on the export of on refined gold. But then Parliament increased that to 5%. So the 5% was very prohibitive, and the exporters stopped exporting. We agreed that we amend the law. So the amendment was done in the mining and minerals law, which is, I think, now being assented to by the President, and we should see that levy removed and the exports will start.
Okay.
Thank you.
So Mlondo, we have answered that question, and now we go to Alex to answer a few questions before we, 1 minute, each one of you. You can actually use that.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, thank you very much for the interesting comments and for also making me become a professor in Kampala. I'm not a professor, just to clarify, but thank you, I'm honored. I'm just an economist, and we've did some analytical work, and the paper I presented is actually looking at the analytics in the past 10 years. The recommendations, as Martin said, are not something new. They were also part of the economic update World Bank published 10 years ago in 2013, and they still remain the same and will be also, again, assessed in the coming months as part of the new economic update to look at where we stand. In terms of the competitiveness and regional integration, I think, and small enterprises, I'll try to link it all. What we realize from the data is that a lot of the companies exporting at the regional level are small companies. The integration in some of the regional value chains or processed products such as dairy came because of the protection from the regional community. Now, what is the solution? I'm not sure I quite know it, but I think a few of the NTBs have been mentioned by the private sector colleagues in the room, from the participants, and Kenneth as well, when it comes to quality facilitation or movement of goods across airports, ports, borders, that still remain an issue and increases cost and time to move those goods around. And one on the suggestions, I think what's maybe the point I would like to share here is that this shield of the EAC, and I think Professor Lawrence also pointed out at that, is that might not be working as well with the IFCFTA, and the competitiveness of those firms is a big concern once the market is going to open, and that's something to take into consideration for policymakers. The solutions, what are they? I think I leave this to the people of Uganda, and same for the gold and mineral exports, which I also leave it to the people here decide on that, but our focus was on agro-processing agriculture and goods and products that can be exported with high domestic value addition, create jobs that are resilient and sustainable in the long term and that require high skilled labor force. Thank you very much. Over to Professor Lawrence.
Yeah, Professor, the audience says you identified the problem, but they had come to listen to Professor for solutions. What solutions do you have? That's what the audience want to know.
Thank you. I think those questions were targeting Professor Alex here, but so I won't sidestep them entirely. But let me come to, I think the critical point, on Minister, that you mentioned is minerals, and you're 100% right. In the presentation analysis that we've conducted, we have not focused on minerals so much. And that's not to, I think, deny the importance of minerals. But I think within the free trade area, when we look at the barriers to accessing the regional market, there are no tariff barriers on those minerals. So it's not necessarily, it's not clear that the tariff restrictions are prohibiting Uganda from exporting minerals to the region. But I think what's very exciting about the AFCFTA is, as you point out, and as was pointed out, this is a very large market. It has potential for high growth, which means that the market size is getting bigger for Ugandan exporters to access. But where Ugandan firms are restricted are on the higher value-added products. That's where the tariffs lie. It's on the end products that appear to be restrictive in terms of tariffs. So what's exciting about the AFCFTA is, by opening up the regional market, by reducing those barriers, this space has been created and these opportunities created to beneficiate some of these minerals, to add value to the minerals, and to start producing some of the final goods with higher value. And that I think comes to one of the key exciting aspects of the regional integration. And we see this. In fact, regional trade is much more diverse than trade with the rest of Africa. And that links, I think, very closely to the sustainability and the flexibility of the economy to adjust to shocks. A key theme of this is what the AFCFTA has is the potential for Uganda to further diversify its export bundle, further increase the number of exporters. And by doing so, it will insulate itself further from global shocks. And I think that's another, key exciting component of the AFCFTA. Now, behind that, I think, relates to this concern about small firms. And I admit I don't know the answer. But what we can see from the data, it suggests that many small firms are accessing the regional market. There's success in developing exporters that can export. But what's also the data suggesting is those exporters tend to export, sometimes the small ones infrequently, and sometimes they don't survive. Now, I haven't looked at the data, and I think this is a key area that we need to understand better. But there's a platform from which to build, because these are the potential future exporters that will access the broader market. So asking the hard questions of what should we do, how do we assist it, how do we ensure survival and then growth, because the enlarged market will facilitate potentially growth of these firms and escape the small firm trap that they may be in. Now, I don't know the answer on that, and I don't want to pretend to know the full answer to that. And in part, I think the experts within the region need to also engage on that. But I think it's a key area for much further consideration. On the one point about opportunities, I think it's absolutely correct. The AFCFTA creates opportunities, but how does that information spread to the broader society? How does the federation of small businesses and so on, how do they participate in this? And I think these are areas where forums are required of much more detailed engagement between government, between these forums, in terms of discussing the opportunities and dealing with some of the channels of accessing international markets. And I'm not aware of these systems in place. I don't know enough on them, but these are often quite important forums to identify constraints and then assist government in identifying the problems and resolving them that affect particular firms' sizes. So I was going to say, I don't know if I answered your minerals question, but I think there are opportunities to beneficiate those minerals through the AFCFTA, and that's exciting.
No problem, but in the next presentation, somewhere you can include the analysis of that. Catherine, you had something to do with private sector in a minute.
In a minute. So one of the questions, where is the private sector? So Trademark East Africa works very closely with the Private Sector Foundation of Uganda. We have what we call the National Oversight Committee, and I think Private Sector Foundation is the deputy chairperson of that committee. And when it's looking at the priorities, and this committee has a lot of government engagement, so when it's looking at priorities for support, it really engages with the various, with the Private Sector Foundation. So the priorities that have been supported have really been developed with the government and the private sector. So perhaps these are new emerging concerns, and as we move towards a strategy, another strategy for our support, these are some of the aspects that we can focus on. But we really, really engage with the private sector as we developed all the infrastructure supports that we set out. And to Martin, the question, thank you for that insight. Briefly, 2010, the costs along the corridor, about 3,400. So we've slashed over $1,000 over the costs over the last 10 years. And like I said, this can still come down further. And just to note that, for instance, of the Nigeria-Ghana corridor, the costs can come close to twice of what we have, what we're seeing on our corridor. And I think on a positive note, we should note that the Mombasa-Kampala corridor is one of the most efficient transport corridors for now, multilateral country corridors that is supporting trade in the region. So I think that's a plus. All our interventions have really come to fruit to some extent. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Final, Alex.
Thank you. There was a question from Donald about the quality. And there are a few things that we have done and we've seen results. Number one, you need to invest as a government in irrigation and soil health, that's fertilizer. But please remember it should be organic, otherwise you're compromising farming for the future. The second one, it's enforcing quality standards at the farm level to make sure that no farmer is putting into the supply chain poor quality cherry. And the last one, it's enhancing the capacity of NACOLI, that's the National Coffee Research Institute, to start giving us varieties that can give us better quality coffee. And lastly, Honorable Chairperson, there was a question to the professors, but as a private sector player, these are things that I deal with. I would like to comment on the question on supporting small exporters. One, it's an agriculture bank that can give us affordable price. Do not look at the funds that you put into commercial banks. We are not accessing them. We only access it if you're large scale. They still use the same risk rating that you're looking at. The last one, it's to decentralize UCDA activities. It's not a time for you to centralize. Decentralize so that we can get cheaper and more efficient services. Take an example from Papua New Guinea that last week appointed a minister for coffee, just because it contributes 6% to their GDP. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's put our hands together to appreciate them. I don't know whether we have somebody from UDB. There was that question which was asked about, and also he has repeated it, access to the money that we invest in UDB is only for large. That's what he's saying, for large companies, not small or medium enterprise, and these are the ones we should be. So it appears no one is here. Colleagues, my session was supposed to begin at to end at 10:30, and I ended at 10:30. But the audience ate into your time for black tea. So MC, I don't know, maybe you'll have to see what to do, but thank you very much, all of you, for participating in this important discussion. Thank you and God bless.
Yes. Surely we can do better. Another round of applause for the Honorable Minister. And now for, of course, purposes of television, we will migrate into our next session. So I would request the TVs please hold, because the small break we have, and I see Director Kagwa was already standing. Please take a seat. Please take a seat. Honorable Minister, there is a seat for you waiting. This is what's going to happen as we buy time for the TVs to stand by. We are having, like we did yesterday, a working coffee break. So we will not take a break for coffee. Just go pick your coffee and return. As we do that, I want to recognize in a very special way the Honorable Henry Musasizi, the Minister for General Duties and the Minister of Finance, Planning and Economic Development. Round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. The PSST is walking away because he has to walk his guest out, so I will recognize him when he's back. Your Excellency, Susan Namondo, thank you so much for joining us. The UN Resident Coordinator, Nelson, thank you. The Mission Director, USAID. Invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, I am serving coffee, and so the TVs will be holding. But as we do that, I wanted to do part of what Director Kagwa will do, is to probably invite his panelists. Your coffee will be after your panel, and I'm hopeful maybe after midday. So if you want, I can get the team from Serena to serve you coffee while you're seated. So probably what I'll do for you, Director, is invite them, and I'll buy you time as the TVs prepare, because we won't start the live broadcast on TV until you're seated and you start. All right. So the panel that Dr. Kagwa, or Moses Kagwa, is going to handle is on the value addition, domestic value addition, and I want to request his panelists to come forward, and then I'll read your profile while you're here. Ms. Priya, Trinity College, Oxford University, please come, take your seat. Ladies and gentlemen, round of applause for Ms. Priya. Our friend Ms. Harriet Connon from the IGC, the country economist at IGC. Ladies and gentlemen, round of applause. Mr. Stephen Asimwe, he's not yet a doctor, so Mr. Stephen Asimwe, the Chief Executive Officer at the Private Sector Foundation Uganda. Stephen, round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, for Stephen. And we have our lead discussant, Hez Kimomi, Linda, Executive Director, Uganda Free Zones Authority. Thank you very much, sir. Round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, for our lead. Any side, you're welcome, because the chair of the session will decide where he wants to sit. All right. I also want to recognize the former Minister of Finance, Professor Ezra Suruma. Thank you, Professor, for joining us this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for our professor, one of the oldest economists in town. Thank you. Thank you very much, sir, Prof, for joining us. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, the Serena team, I suggest you also come and ask if my panelists want coffee. If they do, we give them their coffee from here. So, Emmanuel, I don't know if Emmanuel, we can have someone come and ask, because Stephen likes coffee. I know Stephen likes coffee. Ugandan coffee, so just in case, let's find out. So before I invite the chair, before I invite Moses, allow me quickly run through some of the profiles of our guests who are here, the panelists who have joined us. And I'm going to begin with Ms. Priya, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford and a former country economist for Uganda at the International Growth Center. She worked as part of the IGC Uganda's program on issues related to farm productivity and urban development. Ladies and gentlemen, that is who Ms. Priya is. She looks very young, but she's quite studied. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause. Another lady who looks quite young and loves Uganda is the country economist for the IGC Uganda team, Harriet Connon. She holds an MA in International Development Economics from the Australian National University, and before she joined the IGC, she was an ODI Fellow in Ghana's Ministry of Finance. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Harriet Connon. Round of applause. I'll now move to, I'm quickly finding, yes, Stephen Asimwe is the Executive Director. The title's recently changed, so he's CEO. I don't know why they still say Executive Director. So CEO at the Uganda, at the Private Sector Foundation. He is a former head of the Uganda Tourism Board, and he was engaged in the private consultancy work since 2019, when his 5-year stint at UTB ended, and he's worked He's formerly a journalist because he's worked with the New Vision, and as if you look at his educational background, he's clearly a journalist, and he's in my space. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Round of applause for Stephen Nasimwe. And our discussant, Hayes Kimomi, is Executive Director and CEO of the Uganda Free Zones Authority. He's a practical knowledge in public policy research and analysis, strategic management and performance management with extensive training in managing for results. And before joining the Free Zones Authority, he was head of policy unit at the Ministry of East African Community Affairs, where he contributed to the formulation of Uganda's national policy on EAC integration and other regional subsector policies. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Hayes Kimomi Alinda. Round of applause. It now gives me pleasure to invite our chair for this session, none other than Mr. Moses Kagwa, who's the Director for Economic Affairs at the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development. Ladies and gentlemen, round of applause. Sir, the Honorable Bahati did a fantastic job in managing time. I'll also ensure that at midday, I move you from the stage because the big boys will have come.
Yes, good morning, everybody. And it's a pleasure to be here as we are discussing how we can be resilient to weather shocks. And we had a wonderful session yesterday, and even today we've had a wonderful session in the morning. And this session we are having fits within exactly what we have been discussing, but because we've been looking at exports, and one of the issues that has been highlighted is that we are exporting low-value products. As a result, we are not very competitive on the international market. So we need to do more. And I think this session here that we're going to look at on domestic value addition is very, very important. One, we've been told that we export about 837 million worth of coffee, but the global market for people who don't even produce is about 102 billion US dollars. So how can we position ourselves to have a part of that pie, because it's there. We have seen there have been a lot of developments in terms of export diversification. And now we can export tiles. We've been exporting them to Kenya and Tanzania, part of that. We are exporting steel, beverages, cement, but we need to export more, as you have all heard, and we need to add value to the products. In the PDM, we looked, we have 18 priority products that we have outlined. We need to see how value can be added on them. These include coffee, cotton, cocoa, cassava, tea, vegetable oil and palm oil, maize, rice, and so on. But there is good news. For example, on cassava, we are producing ethanol out of it, and some of it is actually being exported to our neighboring countries. So this is really very important. And I think as we discuss this, we are thinking about the export markets that are available, the regional and the African continental free trade area markets that are there. But not only that, but even beyond. Because, for example, we are exporting some milk products where there's value addition to the US. So the markets are there. It's only the value addition that we should really be concentrating on. And some of the policies, I think we are going to be talking about them to assess what the impact of our special economic zones has been in boosting the economy and also ensuring that we have value added. So I've been helped that my speakers have been introduced, so I won't go to that, but I'm going to make sure that they keep time, not more than 20 minutes from each one of you, but I think we can even reduce it to 15 so that we can have time for the question and answer session. So without wasting more time, I'll call upon the first presenter, Priya, to come and make your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be invited to participate in this year's Economic Growth Forum. Today I'm going to be presenting some initial findings from research on the extent of integration of foreign investment in the local economy in Uganda and exploring policy options to make the most of FDI. The descriptive findings that I'm going to be presenting today are based on ongoing work on the extent of FDI integration across a number of countries with my co-authors listed here. So the onset of the recent pandemic, of course, came with a significant blow to investment and to foreign investment in particular. But as the economy starts to recover, there's an extremely important role for policy in both encouraging the growth of foreign direct investment and in facilitating linkages to local suppliers that can boost the competitiveness of local production. FDI, of course, plays an incredibly important role in injecting capital into the economy and generating jobs, growth, and output. But at the same time, a number of different studies across developed and developing countries have shown that FDI has significant positive effects on the local suppliers that they work with. There's two main reasons for this. One is that FDI firms are often export intensive, and therefore they face globally competitive, global pressures to remain globally competitive, and this in turn means they put pressure on their suppliers to provide very high quality inputs. And the second reason is that FDI firms come with new ideas, new technology, new skills that they can share with the suppliers that they work with. So while foreign investment in Uganda has been increasing in recent years, what this investment looks like and the extent to which it's yielding significant returns for the local economy has been largely an open question. And so the analysis that we do tries to fill this gap by leveraging detailed tax administration data and linking this with data on foreign direct investment in Uganda. So, to set the scene, FDI firms in Uganda are engaged in a number of different activities, with a large majority engaged in a large percentage engaged in manufacturing and wholesale and retail trade. These firms tend to engage in activities that offer higher average wages than the average domestic firm, and although it's not pictured here, they also tend to sell a larger proportion of their sales as exports. I think it's important to note that FDI firms are contributing significantly to the local economy. So FDI firms, here and for the rest of the presentation, I'm presenting information on the universe of firms that are both registered for corporate income tax and also appear in VAT transaction data between the period 2013-14 and 2016-17. We're updating this data, and qualitatively we see sort of similar results for future years as well. And what we see is that FDI firms contribute significantly to local sales, to purchases, to trade. Just to give an example, in 2016-17, these firms made up less than 3% of firms in the economy, but almost 50% of exports for that year. And unsurprisingly, as we can see in this table, FDI firms operate at a significantly larger scale than non-FDI firms with higher sales and trade and employment. But the importance of FDI goes beyond its direct footprint. They also affect other firms in the economy. Using transaction-level VAT data, this figure illustrates that the average FDI firm supplies from 40 suppliers in the economy, and whilst they're directly responsible for about 160 employees through their own employment, they're also responsible for an additional 13 employees on average through the purchases that they make from local suppliers. Now, the way that we calculate this indirect employment is that we assume that it's directly proportional to the sales that suppliers sell to an FDI firm. So to give you an example, if I sell 50% of my outputs to an FDI firm, then we calculate that 50% of my employment is indirectly attributable to the presence of an FDI firm. And this is compared to the average domestic firm that operates at a far smaller scale, of course. So we see that domestic firms ordinarily supply from, on average, supply from 11 firms. They directly employ 29 employees, and indirectly are responsible for an additional roughly 2 employees based on the local purchases that they make. Of course, I'm not at all suggesting that these differences capture some inherent feature of being foreign. It's largely to do with the fact that FDI firms are just operating at a much larger scale. But I think this gives a bit of an idea of what we're talking about when I discuss indirect employment and the impact of FDI on local sourcing. So, accounting for firm size, we then try and compare how FDI firms compare to domestic firms in terms of the indirect employment that they're generating through local purchases. And this graph presents data on the number of indirect employees created for every direct employee that an FDI firm and a domestic firm employs. So the first 4 columns in this graph refer to data for Uganda, and the last 2 refer to data for Costa Rica, which is a country where we have similar VAT transaction data. We have 2 different measures for Uganda here. One is based on using data from the corporate income tax returns on sales, and one is based on using data from VAT transactions. I won't really go into the details here, but these effectively sort of provide a lower and upper bound to what we can say is the indirect employment being generated per direct employee. But I think what's critical to note from this graph is that whichever data you use, we can see that FDI firms in Uganda seem to be generating a relatively similar amount of indirect employment for every direct job they create when compared to domestic firms. So, in other words, relative to their direct employment, we're seeing local sourcing being a similar proportion of inputs for FDI firms when compared to domestic firms. And this is a fairly surprising result. It's certainly not the case for many countries, including, for example, Costa Rica, where we see that FDI firms, for example, source a far lower percentage of their inputs locally, in part because they import a larger proportion of their inputs. So, how do we explain this difference in FDI behavior between a country like Uganda and a country like Costa Rica? So I think one part of this puzzle is the data. If we believe that domestic firms are more likely to engage in transactions with firms that are not recorded in either corporate income tax records or VAT transactions, which I think is a fairly plausible assumption that that's more likely with domestic firms than with FDI firms, then what might be happening is there may be a larger amount of indirect employment being created that we just can't see in the data that we're working with. But I think what's interesting is that in trying to answer this question, looking at data on firm imports and exports also provides another insight into why we might be seeing relatively higher local integration of FDI firms in Uganda. And that's that FDI firms in Uganda, at least compared to Costa Rica, appear to be far more oriented towards the domestic market. So in this way, they're more similar to domestic firms in terms of where they're selling their outputs. And part of this is to do with the types of sectors that FDI firms are operating in, for example, wholesale and retail that are generally less export-oriented. But at the same time, even if we just look at the manufacturing figures, we can see that they're far less export-oriented when compared to Costa Rica. And this is, just to be clear, this is data that shows the percentage of outputs that are being sold locally by firms in Costa Rica in the first table, and in Uganda in the first table, and Costa Rica in the second table. And we have the proportion of sales being sold locally in the left-hand columns, and by FDI firms, and then by domestic firms in the right-hand columns. But the key takeaway here is that even for similar sectors, FDI firms seem to be selling far more to the local market than exporting, and they're much more similar to domestic firms, and this is a different story from what we see in Costa Rica. So in this way, it may be that you could argue that FDI firms do not face the same pressure to import high-quality inputs. And here we're showing the percentage of inputs. Instead of being sold locally, we're now looking at the proportion of inputs that are purchased locally by firms in Uganda and Costa Rica. And again, here what we're seeing is a similar story, that FDI firms in Uganda seem to be behaving more like the average domestic firm when compared to FDI firms in Costa Rica. The exception here is in wholesale and retail, where FDI firms still do import a high proportion of their inputs, a much higher proportion of their inputs than domestic firms. which potentially suggests a role for policy in increasing linkages and potential supply chains from the local market. So, to summarize from what we can see from the data so far, it seems that the data seems to suggest there's a role for policy both in enhancing linkages where possible with FDI firms, but also in attracting FDI that can generate high-quality exports and learning opportunities for suppliers. It's important to note that the analysis that I've presented so far has been based on linkages that we can see through the VAT transaction data. The red bars in this figure illustrate what we can learn from this data about the percentage of sales from local firms that go either directly or indirectly to FDI firms. And the key takeaway from this graph is that the vast majority of domestic firms are not selling any of their outputs either directly or indirectly to FDI firms. We only see a very small percentage of firms that are selling them even over half of their outputs, either directly or through a supply chain to an FDI firm. This is compared to the blue-colored bars, which show the same information, but if we didn't have this individual transaction data and instead relied on average sales between sectors. So the blue bars effectively assume that foreign firms and the suppliers that they work with behave like the average firm in their respective industries in terms of how much they source from local suppliers and how much they sell to FDI sectors. Now, this may seem like a very strange comparison group, but I think it's important to note that these sector-to-sector averages are what's often used by governments to try and calculate the benefits of FDI in terms of their local employment and their purchases. And so these are the kinds of estimates that are used in input-output tables in a number of countries. And what's important to note here is that these clearly overpredict the linkage benefits of FDI firms, and this kind of highlights the importance of VAT data in providing new insights into the distribution of benefits of FDI. So, the next step for our analysis is to look at what kinds of firms seem to be better integrated in terms of their local sourcing behavior. And this is, of course, an extremely important question for policymakers when thinking about which types of firms to target. We are looking at this in more detail now, but one thing we can say at this point is that clearly the sector that a FDI firm operates in plays an extremely important role. And what we see is that accounting for firm size, FDI firms that are engaged in financial activities and in manufacturing, for example, are actually generating more indirect employment through their local sourcing behavior than domestic firms that operate in the same sector. And by contrast, FDI firms operating in wholesale and retail, as we've seen, generate relatively less employment than indirect employment than domestic firms operating in the same sector. And this is in contrast with Costa Rica, where again we see that FDI firms operating in manufacturing are far less integrated than domestic firms in the same sector, in part because of their need to import a large proportion of their inputs. So, given the role of FDI in providing capital, jobs, and the potential for raising local productivity, there continues to be an important role for policy in further facilitating foreign direct investment, but with particular attention to the types of firms that can generate significant linkages to the local economy, and also that have the potential to raise productivity of these local firms that they work with. And priorities for attracting this kind of investment include, for example, providing an enabling environment for high-quality investment. I won't go into too many details on this. I think we've talked about it a lot over the last couple of days, but just to say that cross-country evidence does suggest that non-fiscal incentives are particularly important here, including things like access to electricity, to roads, and efforts to facilitate trade that we've heard about this morning. At the same time, streamlining criteria and processes for entry into the market are an important area for policy focus. So in practice, firms often face bureaucratic delays and have to engage with multiple different agencies in order to set up, which in part explains why Uganda performs fairly poorly on the World Bank rankings for ease of starting a business. At the same time, enhancing legal protections around things like land, contracts, and intellectual property, all of which currently garner uncertainty amongst investors, is extremely important. And finally, improving transparency around investment opportunities and the requirements involved in meeting those opportunities, including for public sector contracts, for example, are extremely important. These efforts to attract more competitive FDI need to go hand in hand with proactive policy to encourage and strengthen local linkages. So cross-country evidence suggests that there are two main reasons that FDI firms struggle to work with local suppliers. One is information asymmetries, where FDI firms simply don't know which local suppliers exist and what they can produce. But perhaps more pertinently, there's also an issue where domestic firms often can't produce at the relevant quality or quantity or reliability that's required by FDI firms. Many countries have attempted to encourage the use of local supplies by imposing local content requirements, but I think it's important to note that the effects of these obligatory requirements have been sort of controversial. In a number of cases, they've had a negligible, if not negative, impact on local production. And just to give a fairly historical example, in Mexico, for example, there were very strict local content rules that were initially put in place to try and encourage the use of local parts for vehicle assembly. This did increase local production, but it came at the cost of globally competitive vehicle production, and as a result, many investors left the country. And I think only when there was a shift in policy towards less restrictive local content and a focus more on local capacity building that we saw the emergence of globally competitive production. So this brings me to my kind of next point, which is that I think in the context of Uganda, efforts to facilitate linkages through capacity building are much more likely to result in long-term improvements in local productivity. So part of the role of government authorities will be to work with foreign investors to identify the key constraints that they're facing in local sourcing. But with that in mind, experience from different supplier development programs from across the world suggests that priorities are likely to include, for example, targeted skills training to meet the needs of incoming FDI. So for example, in Malaysia, SMEs are provided with partial grants to train their employees, but specifically based on curriculum that are determined in collaboration with multinational companies. Another key area, I think, for domestic capacity building will be financial support to FDI firms that are working directly with local suppliers on capacity building through training or product development or other aspects of quality improvement. And these kind of funded collaborative projects have been extremely successful in countries like Chile. I think that's all I have time for, but look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prima, for that wonderful expose. I think you've heard it all about how FDI in this country is helping to boost local competition. When we are comparing with Costa Rica, we seem to be doing much better in that. However, we don't have FDI firms that are engaged a lot in exports, as in Costa Rica. So those are things that we must look at and see what ideas we'd have. The other thing that we have she's talked about are the non-fiscal incentives, which are very, very important. And one of them we are trying to do to improve our competitiveness is having a one-stop center. So it's already established in the law. So under Uganda Investment Authority, so we'll see how we can further improve it to ease the cost of doing business. Thank you so much, Prima. So from Prima, we are going to dive straight onto Harriet. Please.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone. I'm very excited to be here today to talk to you about marketing opportunities for the parish model commodities. So maybe I can get the slides. Yeah, so this is a project that I worked on with Dr. Isaac Shinyakwa and Maya Dennis Makika from EPRC. I think they are in the audience today. So if you have any questions, they were both very tall men. You'll find them afterwards. You ask them the hard questions. Okay. So what do exports have to do with the parish model? I think personally that export markets are crucial for achieving the model's goal to grow the share of Ugandans in the monetized economy. And the first reason why is that exposure to export markets can improve price transmission to farmers. So for example, avocados and tomatoes in local markets are about the same price per kilo, but on export markets, we see that avocados gain around double the price of tomatoes per tonne. So we think that growing cash crops like avocados can help farmers generate extra revenue and ultimately help them to enter into the monetized economy, which is the goal of the parish model. Okay, secondly, I think that understanding which crops present the best opportunities for export development can help to direct extension services, particularly for newer agricultural crops like Hass avocados, where we've got less kind of embedded experience in producing. We also think that this exercise can help the private sector identify opportunities for investment along the PDM value chains, particularly in cases where Uganda has limited capacity to produce higher value-added exportable products. And lastly, we think that this is important because understanding which products and markets present the best export opportunities can help Uganda Export Promotion Board better target its activities on really tractable and realistic export opportunities. Okay, so the first pillar of the parish model is focused on value chain development, and the original ministerial statement highlights 18 commodities, which are up there on the screen now. So that includes kind of crops, livestock, it says dairy, but it's actually dairy, and some nuts. So since the parish model was launched last year, the Ministry of Agriculture has developed some draft operational guidelines in consultation with the districts. And each district has identified a subset of commodities that it wants to focus on. And here we have an example from Soronko. So they've prioritized coffee, banana, cattle, dairy, fisheries, and beekeeping. So some of those commodities are not on the list of the original 18, but that's okay if it reflects what they're very good at growing in Soronko. Okay, so telling farmers what to grow can be a bit risky, right? Crops might not do well in a particular area, or this could cause a surplus of specific products which can trigger a price collapse. I think that the first risk is really well mitigated by working with the district administrations to kind of develop a shortened list that highlights the key commodities that they want to focus on. But the risk of a price collapse can be really devastating for farmers, and it would undermine the objectives of the parish model, which is to grow kind of farmers out of subsistence. So here we've got an example from 2020 of pineapple farmers in Masaka. We had a sort of bumper crop of pineapples, and the average farm gate price fell from 1,000 shillings per piece to 200 shillings per piece, and caused really big devastation. We can also think of the price effects of Kenyan import bans on maize, poultry, and dairy. Ugandan producers lost a really large off-taker when those import bans were introduced. That caused a short-term supply glut and forced prices down, ultimately having quite bad consequences for the farmers. So how can we mitigate this risk? I think the answer is linking up the parish model with diversified export markets, which have robust demand for Ugandan exports of products. And this is the motivation of this paper. Okay, this is a statement from the Honourable Minister for Finance. I'm not going to read it out in the interests of time, but I think it underlines kind of the motivation for this paper. Okay, so there are two ways which Uganda can grow its exports, either by selling greater volumes of products which we're already quite good at producing to establish markets, or we can try to grow exports by diversifying our basket of products or by reaching new markets. And this is sort of what Alex and Lawrence were talking about earlier this morning. In the trade literature, we call these the intensive and extensive margins of trade expansion. And I think diversifying markets is kind of quite a simple concept to understand. So for the purposes of this paper, we just say if Uganda exports a product to a particular market, then that product-market combination is an established market. So for example, if we're selling oranges to Kenya, then Kenya is an established market for Ugandan oranges. When we talk about product diversification, it's a little bit more complicated. So we say that products are established export products if they account for a greater share of Uganda's total exports than the world average share of that product in global exports. So Whoops, going backwards. Here we go. So here's an example of spreadable butter, and we can see that the share of exports for Uganda is larger than the world average share of exports. So we would say that spreadable butter is an established export product for Uganda. And on the other side, we've got an example of live purebred cattle. And Uganda's exports are smaller than the world average, so that's a newer export product for Uganda. I'm going to show you some examples now, which will hopefully make this a lot clearer. Oh, okay. So if we look at this grid, the left-hand side of the grid is cases where Ugandan exports of that product already reached the destination country. So those are established markets. On the right-hand side of the grid, we've got newer markets for Uganda. So Ugandan products don't reach that market country. On the bottom half of the grid, we have products which Uganda is very specialized at producing. And on the top half, we kind of have the newer products for Uganda. So, for an example to start with, we have green coffee to Germany. So we know from the discussion in the last session that green coffee is obviously a very established export for Uganda. And Germany is a very established market for Ugandan green coffee. It's like almost our largest trading partner. However, our green coffee doesn't yet reach Chile. So that's a new market for an established product. Okay, and we also know that Hass avocados are a newer product, but some avocados do reach the UK. So that's a newer product to an established market. And then lastly, we have the example of avocados reaching China. So a newer product and a newer market. No avocados reach China from Uganda yet. Okay, so these are just examples. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we did our analysis now. Okay, so our methodology follows the decision support model approach, which was developed by Northwest University in South Africa, with a few small modifications. So at the outset, we have around 5,300 products in total and 195 different potential trading partners around the world. So if you multiply those two numbers, you end up with a total of just over 1 million product market combinations. But obviously, we want to narrow that million down to a number that we can realistically work with. So for the product listing, we started with the guidance from the Finance and Ministry of Agriculture working documents. And we included all of the raw products on these lists. So, for example, bananas are included as bananas. As well as more processed products that are either already produced in Uganda or that we think Uganda could potentially produce. So for example, we've got different grades of cotton that firms like fine spinners already make, as well as things like instant coffee, which, as we all know, Uganda doesn't currently have the infrastructure to produce, but we think it's a potential export product for Uganda. DEA mentioned earlier that we're now making ethanol from cassava. That one's not on the list. So it's pretty subjective, and I look forward to hearing plenty of submissions from the audience about products that I've missed in the Q&A later. So we map all of these products to the 6-digit HS codes, which are the main detailed product classification used in trade. And from that, we put together a list of 319 products. So then we look at all of the countries in the world and screen them for political and commercial risk using ratings from a Belgian export credit agency. And we sort of want to do this to drop out countries which we think are potentially risky as trading partners. So, for example, Afghanistan drops out at this point. We also screen potential trading partners for macroeconomic size and growth. So we want to identify potential trading partners where the market is growing, not shrinking. And after this step, we reduce down to 160 countries, and we have 319 times 160 equals just over 50,000 potential product market combinations. Okay, so then we use product level import volumes in our partner countries to identify which product market combinations are large and growing. In this step, we apply a bit of sensitivity based on Uganda's level of specialization in that particular product. So there's a higher bar for products which are newer and a lower bar for products which are more established. We then consider the accessibility of these new markets for Ugandan exporters across 3 dimensions. So how concentrated the import market is in terms of trading partners, the tariffs that are applied to Ugandan origin products, and the transport costs that Ugandan exporters would incur to reach those new markets. One limitation of this part of the analysis is that it considers the world as it is today. So for example, it doesn't take into account anticipated tariff reductions under the African Continental Free Trade Area. I think if we reran this analysis when the AFCFTA negotiations are finalised, we'd see a lot more intracontinental opportunities passing through this step. So at this point, we narrow down, we've gone from 1 million, and we have 7,200 realistic export opportunities. And then the last step of this is just to group the opportunities into the categories that we discussed on the previous slide. Okay, so what are the opportunities? I'm not going to show you all 7,200 now, but the full list is available at that link in the yellow box at the bottom of this slide. So I'm just going to give you some examples in the groups that we discussed earlier. First, we have established export products to existing markets. We have 178 opportunities in this category, and boosting export in this quadrant is really a function of just increasing volumes. Just in the products I've got up here, the numbers in brackets are the export potential for Uganda, and you can see that there's a lot of value just in those products that we have up here. These dollar figures, I should say, are not our own estimates. They're taken from the International Trade Centre's Export Potential tool, and they represent the market share that the International Trade Centre thinks that Uganda could capture in these markets. The International Trade Centre only calculates these numbers for products which are more established, so you're going to have some numbers on the bottom half of the slide that you can't compare to the numbers on the top half of the slide. Okay. So the next group is established products to new markets, and there are substantially more opportunities on this side of the grid, as you can see, over 2,000. Exploiting these opportunities is really a matter of improving logistics infrastructure to connect to these markets and promoting the quality of Ugandan products in these markets. The dollar figures here, again, are the ITC's estimates of Uganda's export potential, and we can see that some of the opportunities on this slide are much higher value than on the left-hand side, but it's important to remember that, and I guess some are smaller too, but it's important to remember that the overall number of opportunities here is much larger, right? So there is much more value on this side than in the established products and established markets. Okay, so next we have newer products to established markets. This is a pretty small category, which maybe is not very surprising. It's very difficult to export products which are newer to reach far-flung markets. The dollar figures on this side reflect the total size of the import market, and I've just put that up there to give you a sense of how large some of these markets are. I'm not saying that Uganda can capture all of those markets, but there clearly are large opportunities here. So I think, yeah, one thing to note is that relative to the size of these filled chocolate bar markets in Europe, Uganda's exports are tiny, something like tens of thousands of dollars. So the point I'm trying to make is that there's really a lot of room to grow. And expanding exports in this category is a function of kind of developing Uganda's capacity to produce these products at internationally competitive prices. Okay, and lastly, we have new products to new markets. So you can see this is clearly the largest category with almost 5,000 opportunities. And the dollar values, again, here represent the total size of the import market. So we can only compare them to the numbers on the top left quadrant. Expanding exports in this quadrant means increasing Uganda's capacity to produce these products, but also improving export infrastructure along the value chain, logistics capacity to reach these markets, and promoting Uganda's products in these markets. So they're clearly high value, but there's high costs to reach them. Okay, so I'm going to finish off with some recommendations for how we can more efficiently get parish model products to market. And then on the next slide, I'll talk about some different export promotion strategies that Uganda Export Promotion Board might want to employ. So for commodities that are newer for Ugandan farmers, like the Hass avocado, I think that developing targeted commodity-specific agricultural extension services is critical to encouraging farmers to try out these newer cash crops. I think this is more than just providing trainings, it's also access to inputs like hybrid seedlings, fertilizer, potentially tools. The next recommendation is that most farmers in Uganda are smallholders and they can't access export markets by themselves. So having infrastructure for aggregation of harvest is really, really critical. I think there are a couple of value chains that do this really well in Uganda, and there are value chains that maybe could learn from more established value chains. So coffee, we just talked about earlier. We've got some larger cooperatives that are exporting their members' production directly. We've got aggregators like New Cafe who provide direct trade options for smaller cooperatives. And then we have exporters like Kenneth, who we heard from in the previous session, who use the cooperative structure as a mechanism for aggregation. I think this is really something that other value chains can look to for improved access to export markets. Okay, so in addition to farm-level capacity development, increasing domestic value addition requires investment in processing capacity to allow Uganda to produce higher value-added products at internationally competitive prices. The National Agricultural Advisory Service has developed a really nice model for public-private partnerships in fruit processing all around Uganda. And they've set up a number of processing facilities which act as reliable off-takers for farmers while also promoting value addition. Is this microphone okay? Okay. So in Uganda, we already have some really good infrastructure for improving the marketability of our agricultural product use, and these are the national platforms, which are sort of formal networks of private sector producers and industry experts in particular commodities, and we've got some members of the National Coffee Platform here with us today. These platforms provide a really rich source of information on the barriers that commercial exporters face in their specific commodity and potential opportunities for investment along the value chain. So I think I'm in the WhatsApp group of the National Beef Platform, and there's a lot of conversation about FMD vaccines because foot and mouth disease presents a real barrier to exporting Ugandan beef. I think that tapping into the knowledge of these national platforms to develop commodity-specific export strategies can really help Uganda address key constraints to export development in the parish development model products. Okay. Targeted investment in upgrading transport and warehousing infrastructure will support Uganda's export competitiveness more broadly. And we heard from Catherine in the last session that sections of highway in Uganda are the highest cost parts of road in East Africa. Equally, we know that limited access to competitively priced warehousing infrastructure can lead to high post-harvest losses, which ultimately hampers smallholders' ability to participate in export markets. In the last session, we also had a little bit of discussion about trade finance. I think helping firms to access financial instruments which provide cash flow to exporters based on supply contract with importers is a really great way to boost export volumes. Okay, so looking at all of this, there's clearly a lot of moving parts, and I think there's a clear need for one agency to play a lead role in coordinating all of this as a whole of government approach to value addition in the parish model. I'm not really sure which agency should take the lead on this, but I'd love to hear some thoughts in the Q&A at the end of this session. Okay, and then we've talked about kind of how you get the parish model products to market, but we haven't really talked about how to promote these products in these markets or how to prioritize export promotion efforts. I'm going to go back to my trusty grid to talk about how Uganda Export Promotion Board might strategize its export promotion activities and coordinate with the Ugandan Foreign Service to boost the profile of Ugandan products in export markets. So this bottom left corner is really a volume game, and it's just a matter of capturing more market share. I think these are some of the least risky opportunities in this grid, and export opportunities in this quadrant are really good candidates for trade finance, which can sort of help exporters access high cash flows to ultimately increase volumes. In the bottom right corner, we kind of have new markets, and established products, and I'd categorize this as a medium risk activity. I think a good strategy here for UEPB and the diplomatic missions is to pick similar products as a jumping off point for export promotion. So for example, Uganda already exports soybeans and sesame seeds to Switzerland, but not sunflower seeds or palm nut seeds. These seem like more tangible export opportunities in Switzerland than, say, for example, woven cotton fabrics, which Switzerland doesn't import at all from Uganda. Okay, and in the top left corner, we have the less established export products, which despite being newer, still do reach some export markets. I think these are also medium risk. We have some established trading relationships, but the products we're exporting are new and might not yet be being produced at internationally competitive prices. So for the Export Promotion Board, the focus in this quadrant should be guiding investment to produce export products at competitive prices, and for the commercial attaches of diplomatic missions, the focus should be trying to talk to buyers of these newer products and trying to understand perceptions of Uganda's brand in these import markets, and then sort of feeding this information back to UEPB to inform product export marketing strategies. Okay, so the top right, I think clearly are the highest risk opportunities and highest cost, but also highest value. And I think the strategy here is a combination of the previous two quadrants. So looking at